The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Copper Ridge, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings that lined Main Street. Dust devils danced across the hardpan, stirring up clouds of grit that made the townsfolk squint and pull their hats low. It was market day, and the street bustled with activity. Mexican vaqueros leading strings of horses, farmers hauling wagons loaded with corn and beans, and women in faded calico dresses haggling over prices at makeshift stalls. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore stood on the boardwalk outside his office, his weathered hands resting on the worn wooden railing. At 42, his face bore the deep lines of a man who'd seen too much: the massacre at Buffalo Creek, the failed pursuit of Comanche raiders, the graves of settlers he couldn't save. His badge caught the morning light, a reminder of promises he'd made and broken. The star felt heavier each day, especially when he caught the whispered conversations that died when he walked past. "Sheriff," called out Maria Delgado from her vegetable stand, her voice carrying a hint of the worry that had plagued the town for weeks. "Any word from the territorial marshal about those bank robberies?" Whitmore tipped his hat to the middle-aged woman whose husband had been killed in an Apache raid 2 years prior. "Nothing yet, Maria, but we're keeping watch." The lie came easily. Truth was, he'd received a telegraph 3 days ago warning that Jake "Iron Hand" Maddox was headed this way. The notorious gunslinger had robbed banks in Tucson, Prescott, and Flagstaff, leaving a trail of dead lawmen in his wake. Whitmore had chosen to keep that information to himself, not wanting to panic the townspeople who were already on edge from recent Comanche sightings. A cloud of dust appeared on the eastern horizon, growing larger as it approached town. Whitmore's hand instinctively moved to his Colt .45, a nervous habit he'd developed since taking the sheriff's position. The rider emerged from the heat shimmer like a specter, tall in the saddle, wearing a black duster despite the blazing heat, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. The stranger's horse was a magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming with sweat, but it was the rider himself who commanded attention. Even at a distance, there was something dangerous about his bearing, the way he sat relaxed yet alert, his right hand resting casually near his gun belt. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Pete Sullivan, the Irish saloon owner, stepping out from the Copper Dollar, his thick brogue carried across the street. "That there looks like trouble riding in on 4 hooves." The market crowd began to notice the approaching rider, conversations dying as people turned to stare. Children pressed against their mothers' skirts, while men instinctively checked their own weapons. The stranger's reputation had a way of preceding him, even among folks who'd never seen his face. Jake Maddox rode straight down Main Street, his pale blue eyes scanning the buildings with the practiced gaze of a man accustomed to trouble. He was 35, lean but powerful, with sandy hair that curled slightly beneath his hat brim. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a cavalry saber during his Confederate days. His gun belt was crafted from fine leather, worn smooth from years of use, and the pearl-handled Colt that hung at his hip had ended more lives than he cared to count. He reined in his stallion directly in front of the sheriff's office, the horse's hooves striking sparks from the packed earth. The animal snorted and pawed the ground, as restless as its master. Maddox's gaze found Whitmore immediately, and the two men studied each other across the 20 feet of dusty street that separated them. "Sheriff," Maddox said, his voice carrying despite its quiet tone. There was a southern drawl in his words, refined yet dangerous. "Fine morning for conducting business?" Whitmore stepped down from the boardwalk, his boots echoing on the wooden planks before hitting the dirt. He walked slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible but ready. "Depends on what kind of business you're looking to conduct, stranger. The peaceful kind, I assure you." Maddox swung down from his saddle with fluid grace, his movements economical and precise. "Name's Jake Maddox. Perhaps you've heard of me." A collective intake of breath rippled through the gathered crowd. Women grabbed their children closer, while men's hands drifted toward their weapons. The name Iron Hand Maddox was spoken in whispers across 3 territories, a ghost story made flesh, a legend written in gunpowder and blood. "I've heard the name," Whitmore replied evenly, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Question is, what brings you to Copper Ridge?" Maddox smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Same thing that brings any man to a new town, Sheriff. Looking for a fresh start, perhaps some honest work." He paused, letting his gaze wander across the watching faces. "This seems like a peaceful enough place." "It is," Whitmore said firmly, "and I aim to keep it that way." The gunslinger nodded slowly, as if considering the sheriff's words. "I respect a man who takes his duties seriously." Too many lawmen these days are quick to judge a fellow based on reputation alone. Sometimes reputation is all a man leaves behind, Whitmore countered, feeling the weight of every eye upon them. Actions have a way of following a person. True enough. Maddox's hand moved slowly to untie his saddlebags, and Whitmore tensed despite himself. But the gunslinger merely hefted the leather pouches over his shoulder. I'll be needing a room for a few days. Maybe longer, depending on how hospitable the town proves to be. Pete Sullivan emerged fully from his saloon, his thick arms crossed over his barrel chest. "The copper dollar's got rooms upstairs," he called out, his Irish accent thick with suspicion. "Long as you can pay and don't cause trouble." "I always pay my debts, Mr. Sullivan." Pete Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan. Maddox touched the brim of his hat politely. "And I never cause trouble that isn't brought to me first." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, carrying multiple meanings that weren't lost on anyone present. Whitmore felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, heavier now with the knowledge that his town, his people, were about to be tested in ways they might not survive. As Maddox walked toward the copper dollar, his spurs chiming softly against the boardwalk, Whitmore caught sight of Maria Delgado crossing herself and whispering what sounded like a prayer. Other townspeople began to disperse, but their movements were quick and nervous, like rabbits who'd caught the scent of a wolf. The stranger had arrived in Copper Ridge, and nothing would ever be the same. The Copper Dollar Saloon had seen better days. Much like everything else in Copper Ridge, the mahogany bar bore countless scars from knife fights and pistol butts, while the mirror behind it sported a spider web of cracks from a bullet that had found its mark 3 years prior. Coal oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the walls, their light barely penetrating the perpetual haze of tobacco smoke that clung to the low ceiling. Jake Maddox sat alone at a corner table, his back to the wall and his eyes on the room. He'd changed from his travel clothes into a clean white shirt and black vest, though his gun belt remained firmly in place. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat before him, along with a barely touched plate of beef and beans that Pete Sullivan's wife had grudgingly prepared. The saloon buzzed with nervous energy. Cowboys and farmers clustered around other tables, their voices low but their glances frequent in Maddox's direction. The piano player, a consumptive man named Charlie, who'd drifted in from Kansas, kept hitting sour notes as his attention wandered to the notorious stranger. "I tell you, that's Iron Hand Maddox himself," whispered Bill Hendricks, a grizzled rancher whose spread lay 10 miles north of town. "My cousin in Tucson saw him gun down 3 men in broad daylight, said it was like watching lightning strike." "Keep your voice down," hissed Tom Brady, the bank manager, his pale hands shaking as he lifted his beer. "Man like that's got ears sharp as a hawk's." From behind the bar, Pete Sullivan watched the exchange with growing unease. He'd seen men like Maddox before, during the war, when death rode with every cavalry charge and honor meant less than staying alive. The gunslinger had the same hollow look in his eyes that Pete remembered from Antietam, the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd killed so often it no longer registered as anything more than breathing. The batwing doors swung open with a creak, and Sheriff Whitmore entered, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. Conversations died as he made his way to the bar, his boots echoing on the warped floorboards. Pete poured him a whiskey without being asked, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. "Thomas," Pete said quietly, using the sheriff's first name in the familiarity that came from shared battles. They'd served together in the same cavalry unit, had watched each other's backs through Apache raids and Comanche war parties. "That man's trouble. I can smell it on him like sulfur." Whitmore took a sip of whiskey, feeling its burn all the way down. Maybe. Or maybe he's just a man looking for a place to rest. "And maybe rattlesnakes just want to be petted," Pete replied sarcastically. "You know his reputation, Thomas. How many good men has he put in the ground?" Before Whitmore could answer, another voice cut through the smoky air. "Sheriff Whitmore? That you?" Both men turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows near the staircase. The man was tall and lean, dressed in the leather pants and colorful shirt of a Mexican vaquero. His name was Carlos Mendoza, and the hate that burned in his dark eyes was as fierce as any desert sun. "Carlos," Whitmore acknowledged with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "I came as soon as I heard," Carlos replied, his accent thick with emotion. "Is it true? Is Jake Maddox really here?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Every patron in the saloon turned to look between Carlos and the corner table, where Maddox continued to sip his whiskey, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension. Carlos Mendoza had good reason to hate Jake Maddox. 2 years ago, during a bank robbery in El Paso, Maddox's gang had been pursued by a posse, that included Carlos's younger brother, Miguel, who served as a deputy sheriff. In the running gunfight that followed, Miguel had taken a bullet meant for someone else, a bullet from Jake Maddox's pearl-handled Colt. The young man had lingered for 3 days before dying in agony, calling for his mother with his last breath. "Easy there, Carlos," Pete warned, recognizing the look of a man on the edge. "This ain't the place." "Isn't it?" Carlos's hand moved to the knife at his belt, a wicked blade with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. "My brother died because of that man. He died calling for justice." Maddox finally looked up from his whiskey, his pale blue eyes meeting Carlos's burning gaze across the room. The gunslinger's expression remained neutral, almost bored, but his right hand had shifted slightly, resting now on his thigh just inches from his weapon. "You have something to say to me, friend?" Maddox asked, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent saloon. Carlos stepped forward, his spurs ringing against the floorboards. "My name is Carlos Mendoza. You killed my brother in El Paso." "I've killed many men in many places," Maddox replied calmly. "You'll have to be more specific." The casual dismissal hit Carlos like a slap. His face flushed with rage, and his hand tightened on his knife handle. Miguel Mendoza. He was 22 years old, a deputy sheriff. He had a wife, a baby daughter. Maddox considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I remember. Deputy with the silver star and the fancy mustache. He was quick, I'll give him that. Just not quick enough." "Hijo de puta," Carlos snarled, starting forward. But Whitmore was there in an instant, his strong hand clamping down on Carlos's wrist. "That's enough," the sheriff said firmly. "Whatever grievances you have, they won't be settled in Pete's saloon." "Let him come," Maddox said, rising slowly from his chair. The movement was fluid, predatory, like a mountain cat stretching before a kill. "I never run from a man seeking satisfaction." "Nobody's seeking anything tonight except a peaceful drink," Whitmore declared, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "Carlos, you need to leave now." Carlos struggled against the sheriff's grip, his eyes never leaving Maddox's face. "This isn't over," he spat. "My brother's blood cries out for justice." "Justice," Maddox repeated, tasting the word like fine wine. "Interesting concept. Your brother was wearing a badge when he came hunting me. He knew the risks. He was protecting innocent people. He was getting paid to hunt men like me. That makes him a professional, not a martyr." Maddox's smile was cold as winter steel. "I don't lose sleep over professionals, senor." Whitmore physically pushed Carlos toward the door, feeling the younger man's muscles coiled like spring steel. "Go home, Carlos. Think about your own wife and daughter. They need you alive." After a long moment, Carlos allowed himself to be led outside, but his parting words echoed through the saloon like a curse. "I will have satisfaction, Jake Maddox. On my brother's grave, I swear it." The bat-wing doors swung shut behind him, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Slowly, conversations resumed, but the easy atmosphere was gone, replaced by the electric tension that comes before a thunderstorm. Maddox settled back into his chair, refilling his glass with steady hands. "Seems like a passionate young man," he observed to no one in particular. Pete Sullivan was cleaning glasses with unnecessary vigor, his jaw tight with anger. "That boy's been eaten up with grief since his brother died. Good man, Miguel was. Didn't deserve what happened to him." "None of us deserve what happens to us," Maddox replied philosophically. "We just live with the consequences of our choices." Whitmore remained standing near the bar, his own whiskey forgotten. The weight of his badge seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. He'd seen this before, the slow build of pressure that preceded an explosion. Men like Maddox didn't just bring violence, they attracted it like lightning rods in a storm. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the saloon's windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering down Main Street. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and pregnant with rain that the thirsty land desperately needed. But Whitmore suspected that by the time those clouds broke open, Copper Ridge would be baptized in something far more precious and dangerous than water. The storm that had been threatening Copper Ridge finally broke just before dawn, unleashing torrents of rain that turned the dusty streets into rivers of mud. Sheriff Whitmore stood at his office window, watching the deluge wash away the tracks and debris of the previous day's market. The rain drummed against the glass with relentless fury, matching the turmoil in his mind. He hadn't slept. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind had him reaching for his gun, expecting trouble to come calling. The confrontation between Carlos and Maddox had left everyone on edge, and Whitmore could feel the town holding its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, not moving from the window. Maria Delgado entered, shaking rainwater from her shawl. Her face was etched with worry lines that seemed deeper than they had been yesterday. "Sheriff, I need to speak with you." Whitmore turned, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands worried at the fabric of her dress. "What's troubling you, Maria?" "It's Carlos," she said, glancing around the small office as if the walls might have ears. "He came to see me last night after what happened at the saloon. He's planning something, Sheriff. Something foolish." "What kind of something?" Maria sank into the wooden chair across from Whitmore's desk, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He wants to challenge Maddox to a duel. Says it's the only way to get justice for Miguel." Whitmore felt his stomach drop. "Damn fool! Maddox would kill him before he cleared leather. That's what I told him, but he won't listen. The grief has eaten away at his sense, Sheriff. He talks about honor, about family duty, but all I see is a young man throwing his life away." Tears gathered in Maria's dark eyes. "Here's Elena. She's pregnant with their second child. What will happen to them if Carlos gets himself killed?" The sheriff moved to his desk, sinking heavily into his chair. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical thing. Too many people depended on him, and he'd already failed so many. The families at Buffalo Creek, the settlers he couldn't save from Comanche raids, the trust of a town that looked to him for protection he wasn't sure he could provide. "I'll talk to him," Whitmore promised. "Try to make him see reason." "Thank you," Maria said, rising to leave. "But Sheriff, if talking doesn't work, what then? Will you let them kill each other in the street?" It was the question that had been haunting Whitmore all night. As sheriff, his duty was to maintain the peace, protect the innocent. But the law in these territories was often little more than what a man could enforce with his gun and his courage. If Carlos called Maddox out, tradition and frontier justice said it was his right. Whitmore couldn't stop a fair fight between two willing men, even if one of them was walking into certain death. "I'll do what I can," he said finally, knowing how inadequate the words sounded. After Maria left, Whitmore strapped on his gun belt and pulled on his rain slicker. The storm was beginning to ease, but water still poured from the eaves and turned the streets into treacherous streams. He made his way carefully to the small adobe house on the south side of town, where Carlos lived with his wife and young daughter. Elena Mendoza answered his knock, her face pale with worry. She was a pretty woman in her mid-20s, but pregnancy and grief had aged her beyond her years. Her belly was round with child, and her 3-year-old daughter, Isabella, clung to her skirts with wide, frightened eyes. "Sheriff Whitmore," Elena said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Please, come in out of the rain." The house was small but clean, filled with the scent of fresh tortillas and burning mesquite. Carlos sat at a rough wooden table, methodically cleaning his father's old Colt revolver. The weapon was well maintained but outdated, no match for the modern iron that Jake Maddox wore. "Carlos," Whitmore said, removing his hat, "we need to talk." The younger man looked up, his dark eyes blazing with determination. "If you've come to talk me out of facing Maddox, save your breath, Sheriff. My mind is made up." "Your mind's made up to leave your wife a widow and your children fatherless?" Carlos's jaw tightened. "Better they remember me as a man who stood up for what was right than live with a coward who let his brother's killer walk free." Elena made a sound of distress, pressing her hand to her mouth. Little Isabella began to cry, sensing the tension in the room. Carlos's expression softened momentarily as he looked at his family, but the resolve in his eyes never wavered. "Miguel was my blood," Carlos continued. "In Mexico, in the old country, family honor means something. A man who doesn't avenge his brother's death is no man at all." "In Mexico, you'd also be dead," Whitmore replied bluntly, "and your brother would still be in the ground. What honor is there in that? What honor is there in letting a murderer drink and laugh in the same town where my brother's widow lives?" Carlos snapped back. "Every day Maddox walks free is another insult to Miguel's memory." Whitmore pulled out a chair and sat down, leaning forward. "Carlos, I knew your brother. He was a good deputy, a decent man, but he knew the risks when he pinned on that badge. We all do. And if Miguel were here right now, what do you think he'd tell you? To throw your life away on revenge? Or to live, to take care of his sister-in-law and his niece?" For a moment Carlos hesitated, his hand stilling on the gun barrel. Elena moved closer, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "Por favor, mi amor," she whispered. "Think of Isabella. Think of the baby coming. They need their father." But Carlos shrugged off her touch, rising abruptly from the table. "I've already sent word to Maddox. Noon today, in the street in front of the bank. A fair fight. witnessed by the town. Whitmore's heart sank. Carlos, you can't outdraw Jake Maddox. Nobody can. The man's killed more men than cholera. Maybe, Carlos acknowledged, but maybe I'll get lucky. Maybe God will guide my hand. God helps those who help themselves, Eleanor said desperately. Not those who throw their lives away. I'm doing this for you, Carlos said, turning to face his wife. For Isabella, for the baby, so they can grow up knowing their father was a man of honor. They can't eat honor, Elena cried, tears streaming down her face. They can't hold honor when they're cold at night. The pain in her voice cut through the room like a knife. Even Carlos flinched, but his resolve held firm. He holstered the revolver and reached for his hat and coat. Where are you going? Whitmore demanded. To pray, Carlos replied. To ask Miguel for strength, and to ask God for forgiveness for what I'm about to do. He kissed Elena gently on the forehead, then knelt to embrace his daughter. Be good for your mama, mija, he whispered, and remember that your papa loves you. As Carlos left, Eleanor collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Isabella ran to her mother, crying in confusion and fear. Whitmore stood helplessly in the doorway, watching a family tear itself apart on the altar of misguided honor. Outside, the rain had stopped, but storm clouds still gathered on the horizon. In a few hours, the sun would be directly overhead, and Copper Ridge would witness either justice or murder, depending on one's perspective. Either way, Whitmore knew that blood would soak into the mud of Main Street, and nothing would ever be the same. He thought about his own failures, his own ghosts. Maybe Carlos was right about one thing. Maybe there were some insults that couldn't be borne, some wrongs that demanded a reckoning regardless of the cost. But as he listened to Elena's heartbroken sobs and Isabella's frightened cries, Whitmore wondered if the price of honor was always paid by the innocent. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward noon, each second bringing them closer to a moment that would define not just Carlos and Maddox, but the entire town of Copper Ridge. In the distance, thunder rumbled like the sound of approaching cavalry, and Whitmore found himself praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening anymore. The sun climbed mercilessly toward its zenith, burning away the last of the morning's clouds and turning the muddy streets of Copper Ridge into a steam bath. By 11:30, word of the impending duel had spread through town like wildfire. Shopkeepers closed their doors, women hurried their children indoors, and men gathered in clusters along the boardwalks, their voices hushed with anticipation and dread. Jake Maddox emerged from the Copper Dollar precisely at 1:45, his black clothes immaculate despite the heat. He'd spent the morning cleaning his Colt, checking the action, ensuring every mechanical detail was perfect. The ritual was as much mental preparation as physical, a way of focusing his mind on the task ahead while shutting out everything else. Pete Sullivan watched from behind the bar as the gunslinger descended the stairs, noting the almost casual way Maddox moved, as if he were heading out for a morning stroll rather than a fight to the death. There was no bravado, no nervous energy, just the cold professionalism of a man who killed for a living. So you don't have to do this, Pete called out as Maddox reached the Batwing doors. The boy's got a family. Maddox paused, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight. I didn't start this, Mr. Sullivan. Carlos Mendoza called me out. In this country, a man answers when he's called, or he loses the right to call himself a man. And if you kill him, what then? His wife becomes a widow. His children become orphans. That weigh on your conscience at all? For a moment, something flickered across Maddox's features, not quite regret, but perhaps acknowledgement of the truth in Pete's words. I didn't write the rules, friend. I just play by them. The gunslinger pushed through the doors and stepped onto the boardwalk. The heat hit him like a physical blow, but he showed no reaction. Main Street stretched before him, empty except for the figures gathering at safe distances on either side. The bank stood at the far end, its brick facade gleaming in the brutal sunlight. Sheriff Whitmore was already there, standing in the middle of the street with his arms crossed. His face was grim, etched with the weight of decisions he couldn't make and responsibilities he couldn't escape. He'd tried one last time to talk Carlos out of this madness, but the young vaquero's mind was set as firmly as stone. Carlos appeared from the opposite direction, walking slowly down Main Street with his hand resting on his gun butt. He'd changed into his best clothes, a white shirt, black vest, and leather pants with silver conchos down the sides. His father's gun belt was cinched tight around his waist, the old Colt riding heavy at his hip. The two men approached each other like opposing storm fronts, their footsteps echoing off the buildings that lined the street. Whitmore stepped aside as they drew near. Knowing his role was limited to witness and cleanup, The law had no place in what was about to happen. "You came," Maddox observed, stopping about 30 feet from Carlos. "I wasn't sure you would." "A Mendoza keeps his word," Carlos replied, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "Just as my brother kept his word to protect the innocent." "Your brother was hunting me for money," Maddox corrected. "There's a difference between justice and bounty hunting." "Not to me," Carlos said simply. From the boardwalks, the townspeople watched in tense silence. Maria Delgado stood with several other women, her rosary beads clicking softly as she prayed. Tom Brady, the bank manager, mopped his face with a handkerchief, his hands shaking with nervous energy. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, shifting restlessly at the hitching posts. "Gentlemen," Whitmore called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "you both know the rules. Fair fight, clean draw, no shooting until you're both facing each other. Any man who violates the code answers to me." Both men nodded their understanding. Carlos flexed his fingers, trying to work out the stiffness brought on by nervousness and adrenaline. His mouth was dry as desert sand, but his resolve remained firm. Somewhere behind him, Eleanor was probably weeping, but he couldn't think about that now. This was for Miguel, for family honor, for the children who would grow up knowing their father had faced down the most dangerous man in 3 territories. Maddox, meanwhile, seemed almost bored. He'd fought dozens of these duels over the years, faced men who were faster, stronger, more desperate than Carlos Mendoza. The outcome was never really in doubt. It was simply a matter of execution. He thought briefly of the deputy in El Paso, the young man's shocked expression as the bullet took him in the chest. There had been courage in that face, even in death. Perhaps there would be courage in this one too. "Step off your paces," Whitmore commanded. 20 steps, then turn and draw. The 2 men positioned themselves back to back in the center of the street. Carlos could feel the heat radiating from Maddox's body, could smell the faint scent of gun oil and tobacco that clung to the gunslinger's clothes. For a moment, time seemed suspended, like the instant before lightning strikes. "Begin walking," Whitmore ordered. They stepped away from each other, their boots marking a steady rhythm on the packed earth. 1 step, 2, 3. Carlos counted silently, his heart hammering against his ribs. Behind him, he could hear Maddox's spurs chiming softly with each step, a sound like death bells tolling. 10 steps. Halfway, Carlos thought of Miguel, of the letter from El Paso describing his brother's final moments. The deputy had died bravely, the sheriff had written. Standing his ground even when outgunned and outnumbered, that courage ran in the Mendoza blood, had been passed down from their father, who'd fought against Santa Anna, and their grandfather, who'd stood with Juarez. 15 steps. Almost there. Carlos's hand tingled with anticipation, every nerve ending alive with electricity. He could feel his Colt's weight, could visualize exactly how the draw would go, smooth and fast, thumb cocking the hammer as the barrel cleared leather, finger finding the trigger as the gun came level. 20 steps. Both men stopped simultaneously, the silence so complete that Carlos could hear his own breathing, could almost hear his heart beating. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound seeming to come from another world. "Turn!" Whitmore shouted. Carlos spun, his hand already moving to his gun. But even as he cleared leather, he could see that Maddox was faster, impossibly, inhumanly fast. The gunslinger's Colt appeared in his hand like magic, the pearl handles gleaming in the sunlight. Time slowed to a crawl. Carlos saw Maddox's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the flame blossom from the gun's muzzle, felt rather than heard the bullet whistle past his ear. His own shot went wild, punching through the wooden sign above the general store. But then, something impossible happened. Maddox's second shot, the one that should have ended Carlos's life, went high, so high that it took off the young vaquero's hat and sent it spinning through the air. The crowd gasped in amazement as Carlos, unharmed but stunned, stood swaying in the middle of the street. "Draw or die," Maddox called out, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. But there was something different in his tone now, something that hadn't been there before, a note of respect, warning. Carlos couldn't be sure. The gunslinger's third shot split Carlos's hat clean in half as it tumbled through the air, the bullet passing between the crown and the brim with surgical precision. The crowd erupted in amazed whispers, understanding finally dawning on their faces. Jake Maddox had deliberately missed 3 times. Carlos stood frozen, his smoking Colt still in his hand, staring at the man who held his life in the balance. Maddox's pale eyes met his across the dusty street, and in them Carlos saw not mockery or contempt, but something approaching understanding. "Your brother was brave," Maddox said quietly, his voice carrying despite the distance between them. "He died well. That's more than most men can say." The gunslinger holstered his weapon and began walking away, but Carlos's voice stopped him. "Why?" The young vaquero's voice cracked with emotion. "Why didn't you kill me?" Maddox paused without turning around. "Because killing you wouldn't bring your brother back, and because that pretty wife of yours deserves better than a widow's weeds." As the gunslinger disappeared into the crowd, Carlos sank to his knees in the muddy street, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. He was alive, his family was safe, and somehow, in a way he didn't fully understand, his brother's honor had been satisfied. Sheriff Whitmore approached slowly, extending a hand to help Carlos to his feet. "Come on, son, let's get you home to Elena." As they walked together toward the south side of town, neither man noticed the storm clouds gathering once again on the horizon, or the way the wind had begun to pick up, carrying with it the scent of more rain to come. 3 days had passed since the duel that wasn't, and Copper Ridge still buzzed with conversation about Jake Maddox's unexpected mercy. The story had already begun to take on the embellished quality of frontier legend, with each telling adding new details and dramatic flourishes. Some said Maddox had shot the buttons off Carlos's vest without touching skin. Others claimed he'd spelled out his initials in bullet holes around the young vaquero's silhouette. The truth, as Sheriff Whitmore well knew, was dramatic enough without embellishment. He sat in his office working through a stack of territorial reports when a knock interrupted his concentration. Carlos Mendoza entered, hat in hand, looking remarkably different from the grief-consumed man who'd challenged a notorious gunslinger just days before. "Sheriff," Carlos said, settling into the chair across from Whitmore's desk, "I wanted to thank you. For trying to talk sense into me, I mean." "You don't need to thank me for doing my job," Whitmore replied, setting aside his papers. "How's Elena holding up?" "Better. The baby's due any day now, and Isabella's stopped having nightmares about losing her papa." Carlos turned his battered hat in his hands, the crown still bearing the neat hole from Maddox's bullet. "I've been thinking about what happened out there, about why he spared me." "And what conclusion did you reach? That maybe Miguel's death wasn't about revenge or justice or any of the things I thought it was about. Maybe it was just what happens when men with guns meet in dangerous places." Carlos looked up, his dark eyes clearer than they'd been in months. "Maddox could have killed me easily. The fact that he didn't, it changes things." Before Whitmore could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A dust cloud was rising from the eastern road, not the single rider that had brought Maddox to town, but a group of men riding hard and fast. "Expecting company?" Carlos asked, noting the tension that immediately appeared in the sheriff's posture. "No," Whitmore replied grimly, reaching for his rifle, "and in my experience, unexpected visitors are usually the kind that bring trouble." The riders thundered into town, 6 men on lathered horses, their clothes dusty from hard travel. At their head rode a lean man with a territorial marshal's badge gleaming on his vest. His name was Jonas Crawford, and Whitmore had crossed paths with him before, usually when something had gone badly wrong. Crawford dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, his men spreading out in a loose semicircle. They were all armed, all alert, and all wearing the hard expressions of men accustomed to violence. "Whitmore," Crawford called out as he climbed the steps to the boardwalk. "We need to talk." The sheriff stepped outside, Carlos following close behind. "Marshal Crawford, what brings you to Copper Ridge?" "Jake Maddox," Crawford replied bluntly. "We've been tracking him for 3 weeks, following a trail of blood and stolen money across half the territory. Trail led us here." "What do you want with him?" Crawford's smile was cold as winter steel. "What do you think? He's wanted for bank robbery, murder, and a dozen other crimes. There's a $5,000 bounty on his head, dead or alive." From down the street came the sound of slow, measured footsteps. Jake Maddox emerged from the Copper Dollar, walking with the same casual confidence he'd displayed since arriving in town. He'd obviously heard the commotion and come to investigate, though his expression remained perfectly calm. "Gentlemen," Maddox called out as he approached, "I couldn't help but notice you're discussing me." "How flattering." "Jake Maddox," Crawford announced formally, his hand resting on his gun butt. "You're under arrest for robbery, murder, and crimes against the territory. Surrender peacefully, and we'll see you get a fair trial." Maddox chuckled, a sound like wind through dry bones. "A fair trial. Marshal, we both know I'd never live to see a courthouse. Your boys there look mighty eager to collect that bounty money." "That's your choice," Crawford replied. "Easy way or hard way, you're coming with us." The tension in the street was thick enough to cut with a knife. Townspeople began appearing in doorways and windows, drawn by the drama, but wise enough to stay out of the line of fire. Pete Sullivan emerged from his saloon, wiping his hands on a bar towel, while Maria Delgado clutched her rosary and whispered prayers. Carlos stepped forward unexpectedly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Marshal, this man saved my life 3 days ago, showed mercy when he could have killed me." "That ought to count for something." Crawford's eyes narrowed. "What's your interest in this boy?" "My name is Carlos Mendoza. Jake Maddox killed my brother in El Paso, and I called him out for it. Had every right to put a bullet in me, but he chose not to. That makes me think maybe there's more to him than the stories say." "Stories?" Crawford laughed harshly. "I've got a wagon full of corpses that say otherwise. This man's a killer, plain and simple." Maddox had remained silent during this exchange, but now he spoke, his voice carrying a note of weary resignation. "The Marshal's right, Carlos. I am a killer. Have been for more years than I care to count. The fact that I spared you doesn't change that." "Maybe not," Carlos replied, "but it changes how I see you." Sheriff Whitmore found himself in an impossible position. As a lawman, his duty was clear: assist the territorial marshal in apprehending a wanted criminal. But as a man who'd witnessed Maddox's unexpected mercy, who'd seen the gunslinger choose compassion over reputation, he couldn't help but feel that justice was more complicated than the law allowed. "How do you want to play this, Maddox?" Crawford asked, his patience wearing thin. "My men are getting antsy, and I'd hate for this to turn ugly." The gunslinger looked around at the assembled faces, the marshal and his posse, Sheriff Whitmore with his conflicted expression, Carlos standing protectively nearby, the townspeople watching from their safe distances. Finally, his gaze settled on the copper dollar, where Elena Mendoza had appeared in the doorway, her hand protectively covering her swollen belly. "I reckon I'm tired of running," Maddox said quietly. "Tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of being the man mothers use to scare their children." He slowly reached for his gun belt, his movements careful and deliberate. "I surrender, Marshal, but I want your word that these people won't be hurt if I come peacefully." Crawford nodded curtly. "You have it." As Maddox unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the dusty street, Carlos felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The man who'd killed his brother was also the man who'd shown mercy when vengeance was expected, who'd chosen surrender over a gunfight that would have endangered innocent people. "For what it's worth," Carlos said, as the marshal's men moved to restrain Maddox, "I'll speak at your trial. Tell them what kind of man you showed yourself to be here." Maddox nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I appreciate that, Carlos. Take care of that family of yours. And remember, sometimes the hardest choice is the right one." As the posse prepared to leave with their prisoner, Sheriff Whitmore approached the gunslinger one last time. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why surrender now, after all these years?" Maddox looked back at the town one final time, his pale eyes taking in the faces of the people who'd become, however briefly, part of his story. "Because a man gets tired of being a legend, Sheriff. Sometimes he just wants to be human again." The riders departed as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving Copper Ridge to return to its normal rhythm. But something had changed in the small frontier town, something that couldn't be measured in bullet holes or body counts. The people had witnessed mercy in the face of revenge, had seen a notorious killer choose humanity over reputation. Carlos walked home to Elena and Isabella, his heart lighter than it had been in months. The baby came 2 days later, a healthy boy they named Miguel after his uncle. But this Miguel would grow up in a world where his father had learned that honor didn't always require blood, and that sometimes the greatest victory was choosing not to fight. Sheriff Whitmore returned to his office and his endless paperwork, but found himself thinking often about the gray areas between justice and mercy, between law and compassion. The badge on his chest felt a little lighter, knowing that sometimes even the worst men could surprise you with their capacity for redemption. And in the Copper Dollar Saloon, Pete Sullivan served drinks and told stories of the day Jake, Iron Hand Maddox, chose mercy over murder, adding his own embellishments to a tale that would be repeated for generations. The bullet hole in his mirror had been joined by others over the years, but somehow that particular scar seemed different now. Not a mark of violence, but a reminder that even in the hardest of times, in the harshest of places, human decency could still find a way to shine through. The frontier was a place where legends were born and died with equal frequency, where men were measured by the speed of their draw and the steadiness of their nerve. But sometimes, just sometimes, They were measured by their capacity to choose something greater than themselves, and in that choice, Jake Maddox had found a different kind of immortality than the one written in gunpowder and blood. The wild days were far from over in Copper Ridge, but they would forever be marked by the memory of the gunslinger who said, "Draw or die," but chose instead to let a young father live.